Back in 2016, I was living in a small, isolated town where pretty much everyone knew each other. The area was surrounded by flat land and thick forest, so there wasn't much to do. If you wanted any real entertainment, your options were hiking, camping, or driving nearly an hour to the nearest bigger town. Camping was something I did a lot with my friend Matt. One weekend, he told me that another friend of his had suggested a new spot for us to check out, so we decided to give it a shot. It was only about a 15-minute drive from the edge of town. There wasn't an actual parking area. We just pulled over on the side of the road and hoped for the best. The trail leading in barely looked like a trail at all. It was narrow, overgrown, and clearly not used very often. We followed it anyway, and after walking for about an hour, we finally reached the campsite. Supposedly, this place was known for having a great view of a lake. But if that was true, his friend was definitely playing a joke on us. What we saw wasn't a lake, and it definitely wasn't scenic. It looked more like a swamp. Dark green water, thick vegetation, and an overall eerie feel. Maybe it had been nice years ago, but now it just felt off. We laughed it off at first, until Matt suddenly pointed across the water. On the far side, tucked in between the trees, was a single tent. It was too far away to make out any real details, just one lonely tent sitting there. As I kept scanning the edge of the water near it, something else caught my attention. There was someone standing there, right across the pond, watching us. I gave a quick, awkward wave, trying to be friendly and not make things weird. At the time, we just assumed they were the person staying in that tent. We set up our tents on higher ground, a little ways back from the water, and went on with the rest of the day like normal. We played a few games, talked for hours, and tried to enjoy ourselves. Every so often, though, we'd glance back toward the swamp. What felt strange was that we never once saw the person near that tent. Either they were gone completely, or they were moving somewhere deeper in the trees, out of sight. As daylight slowly faded, there were long stretches where we didn't see anyone at all. Eventually, we gathered some loose branches and scraps to build a fire, pulled our chairs close, and started making dinner. We were mid-conversation, laughing about something stupid, when Matt suddenly shot up out of his chair. His eyes were fixed on something behind me. I turned around immediately. Just beyond the firelight, maybe 20 feet away, there was someone standing there. All I could see was their silhouette. They had long, messy black hair and were dressed in dark clothes. The shadows hid everything else. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, or if they were holding anything. "Hello?" Matt called out. "Are you all right?" I added. They stood there for another second, then quickly backed off and disappeared into the darkness. I turned back to Matt, and even though we were both clearly shaken, we gave each other those nervous half smiles, like we were trying to laugh it off. This happened years ago, and honestly, I don't even remember what explanation we came up with at the time. We just assumed it was the same person we'd seen across the water earlier. Whatever excuse we settled on, it was enough to calm us down and keep the night going without completely freaking out. Somehow, we still managed to fall asleep that night, which honestly makes no sense to me now. I guess we were young, stubborn, and way too confident for our own good. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake when Matt suddenly ripped open my tent and started shaking me. He was breathing hard, panic written all over his face. As I scrambled out, he told me he'd woken up after hearing footsteps outside. When he unzipped his tent to check, he saw the same person standing right next to mine. The second they noticed him, they took off running. Matt was completely shaken, and I knew one of us had to stay calm. Our choices were bad either way. Try to make our way back down that narrow trail in total darkness, or stay put and hope nothing else happened. In the end, we decided the safest move was to get the fire going again and stay awake until morning. We packed everything up just in case we needed to bolt at a moment's notice. The second the sun started to come up, we didn't hesitate. We left immediately. Later that day, after talking it through, we decided to file a report with the local police, mostly to warn them that someone out there was acting strangely. What we didn't expect was a callback asking us to come in and answer questions. That's when things took a much darker turn. The tent we'd seen across the water belonged to a person who had been missing for over a month. Authorities had already searched the area, but they hadn't found anything else. They showed us photos of the missing person, and both Matt and I were certain it wasn't who we'd seen that night. That realization was terrifying. Whoever was out there was likely connected to that disappearance, and if Matt hadn't woken up and scared them off, there's a good chance I wouldn't be here telling this story. I had set up a small campsite deep in the woods behind my house. I own a good stretch of forested land, and every now and then I like to take advantage of it by going on a simple solo camping trip. It's only about a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house, and I'd already cleared out a small area to use as a campsite. There was nothing impressive about the location, no lake, no scenic overlook, nothing like that. It was just a calm, secluded spot in the trees where I could unwind. This happened sometime in the middle of fall, and that afternoon around 4 p.m. I headed out to settle in. As I was setting everything up, something caught my attention. I noticed a person walking through the woods, maybe about 100 yards away. What made it odd was that this was my property. The land around it belongs to other neighbors, so the only way someone could have ended up there was by crossing onto my land. I wasn't angry about it, just confused. I couldn't figure out why or how they were back there. Since they were moving away from my house and in the direction of my neighbor's property, I decided not to make a big deal out of it. After that, the next few hours were quiet. I didn't see anyone else, and I spent most of the time sitting in my lawn chair, relaxing and listening to the sounds of the woods. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the woods grew dark and started to fill with a low, misty fog. I lit the fire pit I'd set up earlier and piled in a few logs and sticks to keep it going. About an hour after nightfall, while I was tossing more wood onto the flames, I heard something that made me freeze, footsteps off in the distance. I turned toward the sound and realized someone was running. Not walking, not pacing, full-on sprinting through the forest. It was completely dark out there, so I couldn't see anything, but I tracked the noise as it rushed past my campsite and disappeared deeper into the woods until it faded away. There was no mistaking it. It was definitely a person. What I couldn't understand was why anyone would be charging through the woods at night like that. The whole thing left me feeling uneasy. For a moment, I considered packing everything up and heading back to the house. But whoever it was didn't seem to notice me, or at least didn't care that I was there. I figured I'd be fine, and if something did happen, my house was only a short run away. So I kept the fire going and stayed outside for another couple of hours. Other than that strange moment, the night was completely silent. Around 10 p.m., I let the fire die down, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep not long after, though as it turned out, that sleep didn't last very long. I was jolted awake by the sound of someone running straight toward my tent. I snapped upright as the footsteps rushed closer, stopping suddenly just outside, no more than a foot away. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out a shadow through the thin tent wall. The figure was swaying slightly, like they were trying to see inside. Then I heard fabric rip. I glanced to my left, just in time to see a blade dragging across the tent, slicing a small opening into it. A moment later, a pair of eyes appeared in the gap, locked directly onto mine. That was it. I leapt to my feet, burst out of the tent, and took off into the woods, screaming as I ran. Pure adrenaline carried me all the way back to my house. I never heard footsteps behind me, so it didn't seem like they chased after me. But when I was on the phone with the police, I looked out the back window, and there, in the trees, was a figure standing still, watching my house. By the time officers arrived, whoever it was had vanished. They returned the next morning to check the campsite, but days went by without any real leads. What made it even more terrifying wasn't just that someone had been running through my property at night with a knife and slashing open my tent. It was the fact that they followed me home. They knew exactly where I lived. For the next month, I barely slept, constantly on edge. So far, nothing else has happened. But if it ever does, I just hope I'll still be around to give you an update. This happened about 3 years ago, right at the start of December. Where I live, winter doesn't really hit hard until later in the month, and we usually don't see snow until January. I go camping a lot, and I always try to squeeze in as many trips as possible before winter shuts everything down for a few months. I had taken the first weekend of December off from work, so I could do one final trip before the season changed. I picked a spot about an hour north of where I live. I knew it would be a bit colder up there, but I didn't think the difference would be significant. I wasn't too worried anyway. I had gear rated for colder weather. I left early that morning and reached the trailhead a few hours after sunrise. There were already 2 vehicles parked there, a normal-looking minivan and a truck that clearly had been off-roaded, covered in mud and scratches. After parking, I started down the trail. The cold was noticeable, enough that I zipped up my jacket and pulled on a hat. Not long after, I passed an older man hiking with his kid. It looked like they'd spent the night out there, which explained one of the vehicles I'd seen. When I finally reached the campsite, I expected to find at least one other group still there, but it was completely empty. Just an open, grassy clearing beside a small, flowing pond. No tents, no people. I set my tent up along the tree line. For a while, I sat and wrote in my journal, but as the day went on, the temperature kept dropping. Eventually, I got up and built a fire to help stay warm. Not long after, someone else appeared on the trail. It was a man, probably in his 40s, wearing a thick coat and a cloth covering the lower part of his face. He had a small backpack, but as he walked past me to the other side of the campsite, I noticed it was practically empty. There was barely anything in it. He sat down, leaning against a tree. I figured maybe he had a friend further down the trail who would show up soon. But an hour didn't pass, maybe around 45 minutes, and nobody else came. Meanwhile, he didn't move. He just sat there, staring out at the pond. I wasn't sure whether to feel sorry for him or just plain uneasy. But then, without warning, he got up and started walking toward me. When he reached the other side of my campfire, he stopped and sat down, smiling at me across the flames. "Hope you don't mind me sharing your fire. It's colder than I expected," he said. I nodded, trying to be polite, but feeling a little on edge. There was something off about his smile. It didn't match the rest of his face. His eyes were droopy and tired, making the smile look almost forced. "Did you bring a tent? It's probably going to get colder tonight," he asked. He shook his head, but didn't seem concerned at all, still wearing that strange smile. After that, we sat in silence for about 10 minutes. During that time, I'd already decided I wanted to leave, but I felt nervous about packing up my gear while he was watching me so closely. The sun was already sinking fast, and I knew that if I was going to leave, I had to do it immediately. I stood up and walked over to my tent, pulling out my sleeping bag and rolling it up. The entire time, I could feel his eyes on me. When I turned around, he was staring straight at me with that same unsettling smile. He got to his feet, never breaking eye contact, then walked back toward the tree he'd been leaning against earlier. But he didn't stop there. He kept going, moving past the tree and into the woods until he disappeared from view. I stood frozen for a moment, straining to hear his footsteps, but the forest was completely silent. I had no idea what was going on, but I was convinced he'd be back at any second. I rushed to pack up the rest of my gear, and within 2 minutes I was already heading back down the trail. I left the campfire burning on purpose, hoping that if he was watching from somewhere, he'd assume I was still there. The next 2 hours were some of the most nerve-wracking of my life, walking through the darkness in freezing temperatures, constantly expecting to hear footsteps charging up behind me. Somehow, I made it back to my car and drove straight home. When I reached the trailhead, I noticed the old truck was gone. If that vehicle wasn't his, then I still have no idea how he got there. Either way, I'm certain that if I had stayed the night, something bad would have happened. He may have gone into the woods to retrieve something before coming back, or he could have been hiding out, pretending to leave so I'd feel safe enough to stay, only to return while I was asleep. Whatever his plan was, the thought of what almost happened that night is something I'll probably never stop thinking about.